Hi again. Okay, I want to wrap up our discussion of the apology now. Um, so last time we got to the end of his little engagement with Miletus, where he looked at the specific charges Miletus was making and tried to show that they didn't hold up. They weren't really coherent. But now he's going to continue in a way answering those charges, but not on those terms. He's going to talk on his own terms, and basically here from 28b to 35d, which is the end of his defense speech, he tells you on his own terms what he stands for and so on. And this material is very, very rich, I think. So he is telling you on his own terms what he does, but he is also still in a way answering to those charges. And I'm going to look at two main points here. One, where he tells you these things about himself, and in doing that, he really answers to this question of whether he believes in the gods. And then another section where he tells you some other stuff, and in telling you that other stuff, he also kind of answers this question about him introducing daimonia, other new divinities. And then there's a little bit after that where he does talk about this issue of corrupting the young, so we will have addressed all three of the charges. I'm not sure if I'm going to actually get around to saying anything about that. The stuff I'm really interested in is 28b to 33e. And then I should also add, that's his defense speech. Then he's found guilty. After that, he has another little speech where Miletus has called for the penalty of death, and Socrates gets to propose his view of what the penalty should be now that he's guilty. So there's a little speech about that, and then they sentence him to death, and then there's another little speech he makes to people. He says, "Okay, they're going to kill me, but I can talk to those of you who voted on my behalf," and so on. He says a few other interesting things there. That material is quite good too. It's not so relevant to my particular purposes here. Anyway, so. So he begins this section after initially talking to Miletus. He says, he begins by saying, this is at 28b. "Well, perhaps then someone might say, then are you not ashamed, Socrates, of having followed the sort of pursuit from which you now run the risk of dying?" Like here you are in court and we're sentencing you to death. Like, aren't you embarrassed about what you've done? Something like that. And Socrates says then something I think is quite important. He says, I'm going to read the exact thing. He says, "I would respond to him with a just speech." And he says, this is what he would say. "What you say is ignoble, fellow. If you suppose that a man who is of even a little benefit should take into account the danger of living or dying, but not rather consider this alone whenever he acts, whether his actions are just or unjust, and the deeds of a good man or a bad." And that's pretty significant. So just that last part again, he says, you should consider this alone when you act, this alone, whether your actions are just or unjust, and whether they are the deeds of a good man or a bad man. That's a pretty powerful point. And so he says, this is what you should consider when you act. Lots of people, when they're thinking about acting, would consider, in this case, oh, should I do it? I might die. Right? And he says that shouldn't be your starting point. The issue isn't whether you live or die. The issue is whether you're good or bad. Right? So there's nothing, he's saying there's nothing that should come before that question. What should I do? Like, that is to say, what is the good thing in itself that I should do? Such that my action would be just, that I'd be a good man. Any other consideration is going to be secondary. You might have lots of other considerations. You might have consideration like, am I going to make money or whatever? Like, he doesn't even get to those. He cuts to the biggest one. Like, you shouldn't even care about death. And in fact, that might even remind you of the second chorus of Antigone, where he says, the human being has a contrivance against everything except death, right? So the second chorus of Antigone made that point, that death there's something kind of ultimate about that, right? It's a place where we run up against a certain kind of limit. And so he's jumping right to that point here and saying, yeah, even at that point, you have to follow the good. And that's the theme that's going to now just continue throughout all of this. But the good. The thing I want to emphasize here is his point that the thing that matters in a life is not whether you live or die. It's, well, as he says, whether what you do is just or unjust, or whether you you're a good man or a bad man. The way he's about to put that is, it's not whether you live or die, it's what you take your stand on. So let me clarify that. So he says, think about soldiers in battle. So first of all, he refers back to Homer's Iliad and talks about the great stories of the Trojan War. And he says, the stories that found our nation, that our culture, are stories of people risking their lives in battle, right? And so he says, the people you celebrate as heroes are not people who take death as the thing that makes them decide what they're going to do. They risk their lives for what they're fighting for. And he says, I did that same thing when I was in battle. So he fought in various battles of the Peloponnesian War. And he says, in those cases, I stayed where the general stationed me, and I ran the risk of dying like anyone else. Right? So he says, so first of all, he's done that. He's fought for the city. And even that should remind you of Pericles' funeral oration, right? Pericles was giving a speech for the people who died in the war. And his point there was, these men were worthy of their city because they died for it, right? So that whole speech was about people who are willing to die for something that they consider more important, right? Well, Socrates didn't actually die, but he was willing to. And he tells these stories, which are presumably true. Other people say the same thing about him. He tells you these stories where he risked his life. He didn't actually die, but he was ready to. He did. In fact, the stories he tells are retold by other people, and they're actually stories of considerable bravery. So, by Pericles' standard, Socrates is a man worthy of his city, right? That's already a thing worth thinking about in the context where he's being put on trial by Athens. And he's, just as a kind of a war hero, he's a guy that you might think the city should be celebrating just because of that action. But they're not, right? But he says, anyway, you shouldn't be concerned about death. And now he's going to go on to say the more serious thing. He says, so he says, this is the way, this is at 28d. He says, this is the way it is, men of Athens, in truth. Wherever someone stations himself holding that it is best, or wherever he is stationed by a ruler, there he must stay and run the risk, as it seems to me, and not take into account death or anything else compared to what is shameful, would be not doing what is best. So yeah, so then he gives the example there of staying where the general put him. But notice what he said here. Wherever someone stations himself holding that it is best, or wherever he is stationed by a ruler. So first he gives that example of himself going where he was stationed by a ruler, right? But the point is, but the thing I want you to notice is this other thing. Wherever someone stations himself holding that it is best, right? That's why I used the expression a minute ago. It's what you take a stand on, right? Where you station yourself. That's the thing that he's really ultimately interested in. What do you take a stand on? Because that's going to be the deepest answer to who you are, right? Because it's going to be the answer to the question, what do you take to be the highest value, and therefore that in terms of which you should be evaluated, right? And so it's interesting that he says, wherever someone stations himself holding that it is best, right? Because that makes something clear, something that's true, I think, but it makes it clear, and that is that different people, I suppose, will make different decisions about what is best. And so anyone, you have to station yourself, and you do that by your judgment, going back to that theme we raised with wisdom, based on your judgment about what is best, what is the ultimate good, right? There is important for many reasons. One point, just to go back to an earlier thing, there you see that in the case of any person at some level, you will see that's what they're doing. People have made their choices about what they hold to be the good for them, the best for them. And that's what people will do. People will act in accordance with what they take to be the good. And that's why in that earlier discussion, he was saying, nobody corrupts people voluntarily. He was saying, nobody really does the bad voluntarily, except in an equivocal sense of the word bad. Because the very meaning of what it is to be someone is that at some level, at some core level, you have stationed yourself somewhere. You've made a decision about what is best, and that's what you're basing your life on. And that your decision, your judgment about what is best, is the primary thing that's going to determine what you take to be good and bad. Right? So, yeah, the courts may say that something is bad. Other people may say that something is bad. But the good and bad you live by is this choice that you've made, right? So people do what they take to be good. What they have decided is the good for them, what they have judged to be the good for them. Anyway, you can think about that if you go back and read that thing about involuntary or voluntarily corrupting people. The thing I want to really bring out here, though, is just this idea that this is a thing about people. We station ourselves somewhere holding something to be the best, right? And he says, that you should risk that. You should risk your life for that, right? If you aren't prepared to risk your life for that, or maybe let me put it this way: if there's something that you normally do that you're not prepared to risk your life for, that shows something about what you take to be best. It shows that you take just the fact of being alive to be best, because you will sacrifice that for the sake of not dying. Socrates saying that's not a very high standard. So anyway, but let me carry on with Socrates talking about himself. So he says, in the battles of the Peloponnesian War, he said, "I stayed then where they stationed me, the generals, and ran the risk of dying like anyone else. But when the gods stationed me, as I supposed and assumed, ordering me to live, philosophizing and examining myself and others, it would be awful if I had then left my station because I feared death or any other matter whatsoever." Right? So he says, "I would have done terrible deeds if when those other people I would have done something terrible if when those other people stationed me at those military battles I stayed, but when the gods stationed me to go around philosophizing, I balked when that was going to end my life," right? So notice the point he's making there. It's got a few levels to it. On the one hand, he's saying this thing that I am doing, that I'm on trial for, going around and philosophizing, and he puts that name to it. He says, that was the God stationing me. Why does he say that? Well, he says that because this whole thing came from the Delphic Oracle, from Chaerephon going and asking the Delphic Oracle, is anyone wiser than Socrates? And then Socrates basically, he says, building his life around testing what that oracle said when it said no one is wiser than Socrates. So at the most sort of immediate level, there's a straightforward reason for him saying to those people in court, the God stationed me here, because the Delphic Oracle, the words of the goddess who speaks on behalf of Apollo, said this thing, which is what his whole life has been about. So he has pretty good credentials by the standards of, whatever religious people there are in his audience, Athenian religious people. He's got pretty good credentials for saying he's doing the God's work. Do you think that that's really what's going on with him? Do you think he really was doing this because somebody in Delphi said this thing? My suspicion is probably not exactly. I think the point is more the sort of thing he's going on to say throughout this. He does what he does because he thinks that's what the good commands. That's what justice commands. It's good in itself. So it's not just his arbitrary decision about what he's going to do, but it's what his own attempts to grasp what the good is show him to be the path he should follow. So I think he does believe, in some sense of the word, that he's doing the God's work. I think that what he means by the God is really the good. But he has every reason to say, but Apollo told me that, right? I got these words from the Delphic Oracle. So in other words, I guess from different angles, he has a lot of justice in saying the God stationed him there, right? In the more traditional sense, for people in Athens who believe in those kinds of things, it's in the sense that the Delphic Oracle said the thing that his life has been following out. In the sense that seems to me to accord more with the way he tends to talk about things, he means, he finds himself stationed. It's not just an arbitrary choice on his part to do this. He experiences himself as basically called upon to do this, commanded. He's submitting, you might put it this way, he's submitting to a higher authority when he's going to do this. And so he could save his life. But if he did that, or he could try to save his life by trying to not get killed, sentenced to death here. But if he were to do that, he would be turning on his back on the thing he actually believes to be the best, the thing that he actually believes is commanding him. So he's not going to do that. So he says, it'd be terrible if I stayed where the general stationed me, but then when God stationed me somewhere as I supposed and assumed. So he's saying, that's my belief, right? If then I left my station because I feared death. So like I said, he's talking about values, he's talking about taking a stand and so on. And you can see he is also answering that charge about whether or not you believe in the gods. He's saying, I've based my life around belief in the gods, in some sense. And maybe we'll come back and talk again about just in what sense, but I'd like you to think about that. Anyway, he says, but so then he says, it would be, this is the thing, if I were to ignore what I experience as my calling, right? If I were to turn my back on this thing that I was doing, that's when someone should say, Socrates doesn't believe in the gods. Right? So he says, terrible that would be. And truly then someone might justly bring me into a law court, saying that I do not believe that there are gods, since I would be disobeying the divination and fearing death, and supposing that I am wise when I am not. We'll get onto that wise thing in a minute. But I think his point here is quite powerful. This is where you should ask yourself a question, right? The question really, what does it mean to believe in God? Does he? You can go and do your goat sacrifices, on the prescribed days, or perform the various rituals and so on that you want to engage in. You might have a spotless record of doing all the things you're supposed to do on Sunday or whatever. Does it follow from that you believe in God? You might even say those sentences, oh yeah, I believe in these things and I do all of these rituals. Socrates' point here, I think, is that there's something deeper than that. And that is experiencing the weight of a kind of calling, experiencing the weight of being answerable to, let's say, a higher value, to the good as such. Not this particular good or that particular good, but the good. Such that you live your life on its terms, right? Rather than using your own life to set the terms of what you're going to do, right? That's what it means really to answer to a higher calling. You're not just living your life based on what you want. You are experiencing yourself as, in some sense, a servant of a higher power. If you're not doing that, then someone might he's saying here, then someone might really well ask whether you do believe in the gods, even if you do all those rituals, sacrifices, prayers, or whatever else it is that you're supposed to be doing. If those are just things that you can check off, but you live as if your perspective of a person just trying to satisfy himself is good enough, then that makes it seem like you don't believe in the gods. That makes it seem like you don't believe in something higher you have to answer to. Again, go back to the second chorus of Antigone and the talk of the gods there. The earth, oldest of gods, immortal and unwearied, right? And then the related thing at the end, right? If he's honored the laws of the earth and confirmed the justice of the gods by oath and so on, remember those things, and again think about what it really means there. Should talk about believing in the gods and what it's contrasted to. I mean, it's really contrasted to a kind of hubris. Hubris is a Greek word. It means when you have an overblown sense of your own importance and think you're too great, and in fact try to live beyond the limits of what is proper to the kind of thing that you are. Remember the second chorus was kind of about the hubris of human beings who imagine themselves to be masters of nature, right? And that's contrasted with something like honoring the laws of the gods. Well, I want you to think about the same kind of issue here, right? That there's honoring the laws of the gods, or as they say, conferring by oath the justice of the gods, which means, I think, recognizing them to be good and so on, seems to mean something a bit deeper than just performing some rituals that were handed down to you by some other people, right? It seems to require something more at the level of kind of personal recognition and personal commitment. In any case, that's what Socrates is saying. You may or may not agree with that as an interpretation of belief in the gods. You may or may not think, therefore, it's up to you to decide then whether you think Socrates believes in the gods or not. You may not think those are the terms you want to use to describe it. That's fine. All I'm trying to do I'm trying to do two things. I'm trying to get you to see what Socrates stands for, and trying to see why that is at least plausible as an interpretation of what it really means to believe in God, and therefore stands as a kind of critique, a criticism of what is often put forward as if it were belief in the gods. And so Socrates here is saying, if anybody believes in the gods, I do, because I have lived my life holding my life answerable to a higher power and doing my best to discern what that higher reality commands me to do. What is that higher reality? It's like the good. You got to do the good. In any case, let's go on here. He says, I just want to read this last part just because it's significant for a lot of reasons. He says, terrible that would be, and truly then someone might justly bring me into a law court saying that I do not believe that there are gods, since I would be disobeying the divination and fearing death, and supposing that I am wise when I am not. Why does he say that? Well, he says, if you fear death, you imagine death is a bad thing. You imagine yourself to know death to be a bad thing, and so you fear it. You don't know what death is. Death is a thing that's sort of defined as something you have no access to. If you're going to find out anything at all about what death is, I mean, you might not find out anything. It might just be the end, right? But if you're going to find out anything, it's not going to happen until you die. So you don't know what it is. Maybe it's the best thing ever. Right? So it doesn't make sense to fear death. Death, in a way, precisely defines that of which you are ignorant, that of which you have no knowledge. So it doesn't really make sense to fear it, because to fear it, you have to have made a claim about it, and that it's a bad thing, right? And you have no good reason for doing that, right? So he says, if you fear death, you actually imagine you know something you don't know. So he says, I don't know what death is, so I don't know whether I should fear it or not. What I do know is that it's shameful to do injustice, and so I don't do that. Right? So he says, compared to the bad things that I know are bad, I will never fear or flee the things about which I do not know whether they might even happen to be good. So that, I think, is, first of all, it's just such a powerful point. I think that's one of the most significant things. Just the general theme of taking a stand, and that with respect to a human being, what matters for a human being, what is really definitive of a human life is what you take a stand on, not whether you live or die, right? And then the second related point, the way I wanted to bring that point out in conjunction with his point that what he's taking a stand on is effectively his belief, what he's been commanded to do by God, right? His belief in God. So he's saying this is the fact that he does that is also a kind of defense against Meletus's charge that he doesn't believe in the gods. And he goes on to say, I'm not afraid of death. And he said, even if you guys said we're not going to kill you, but you have to stop philosophizing, he says, I would not do that. I would not accept that. And then I want to read a little bit now about how he describes himself. He says, we'll let you go on this condition, that you no longer spend time philosophizing, otherwise you're going to die. If you did that, I would say, I will obey the God rather than you. I'm going to say more about that, but there again, notice again a pretty powerful parallel. There he's saying very much what Antigone says. Yeah, you guys are a court. You make the laws, and you say, Socrates, you have to do this, or you get the penalty of death. And he's saying, yeah, that's your human law. It's a great thing, but there's something higher, and that is effectively the divine law, right? Like he, very much like Antigone at that spot. I was reading from 29d. At that spot, he effectively says the same thing Antigone says. I take my stand on divine law, not on human law. But so this the terms in a way are the same of what they say, but what do they mean by it? What does Antigone mean when she stands by divine law versus what does Socrates mean when he stands by divine law? And this, I guess, is going to kind of reproduce a point I was just making. Antigone pretty much takes a stand on traditional observances. You got to put dirt on the dead body. You got to honor the fact that you're the daughter and somebody else is the son, and you as a daughter are responsible to the son, right? That's what she means by divine law. What Socrates means by divine law is you have to devote every dimension of your life without any qualification to the pursuit of what is good in itself. Those seem to me to be quite different understandings of what the divine law is. So even though they're both taking a stand on divine law as something superior to human law, those are the terms from Antigone. Here he's saying, I'm going to follow the God rather than following what the law court commands, but the issue is the same. Even though they're taking the same terms, it seems to me that Socrates' stand, which is, again, Antigone took a stand, so she was doing the same thing Socrates is doing in that respect. What they take a stand on, even though it has the same name, divine law or the gods or something, seems to me it means something very different. So I would encourage you then to think about that difference. So in a way, we actually have three terms. We have the divine law as Antigone understands it. We have the human law, and then we have the divine law as Socrates understands it, or the answering to the God as Socrates understands it. Those are three different things, all three different things one could answer to, it seems to me. So I'd like you to think about the difference and think about the different meaning to the stance Socrates is taking to what he thinks of as the limitations of this human jury. The difference between that and Antigone's stand against the human law. But anyway, let's keep reading here. So he says, I'll obey the God rather than you. And he says, I will not stop philosophizing. And here, like, he's going to say a little bit about what philosophizing means, and I think you should store that. Like it's relates to some things I already said, but many different things go by the name of doing philosophy. Here's what Socrates says: I will not stop philosophizing, and I will exhort you and explain this to whomever of you I happen to meet. and I will speak just the sorts of things I'm accustomed to doing. I will say, best of men, you are an Athenian from the city that is greatest and best reputed for wisdom and strength. Are you not ashamed that you care for having as much money as possible and reputation and honor, but that you neither care for nor give thought to prudence, wisdom, prudence and practical wisdom, prudence and truth, and how your soul will be the best possible? So first of all, that's what he says. A lot of things in there too, right? Athens, greatest city, right? I'll come back to that. But the thing he says, to you is, you've taken your stand on the wrong things. You should be ashamed that you care about money and you don't care about what is best, like taking care of your soul, and he says, if one of you disputes or asserts that he doesn't care, I will not immediately let him go, nor will I go away, but I will speak to him, and I will examine and test him. And if he does not seem to me to possess virtue, but only says that he does, I'll reproach him, saying that he regards the things worth the most, the good, as the least important, and he regards the paltrier things as the most important. And I will do this to whomever, younger or older, I happen to meet, foreigner, townsman, but more so to the townsmen, as much as they're my kin. And then he says, know well that the God orders this. Again, so that comes up. But I want you just to think about that thing he says. That's what philosophizing is. As Socrates understands philosophizing, it's not going to the university and reading books by important, European thinkers and debating with your friends in the coffee shop about this or that. It's not that those things are irrelevant, but that's not the essence of philosophy. It might be relevant to it, but philosophy is about being committed to the good and being committed to engaging with others around that same issue, right? And engaging with others at the level of testing their beliefs for the purpose of exhorting people to care about the things that matter. That's what philosophy is. And yeah, let me just go back to that one thing he said. He said, you are an Athenian from the city that is greatest. So notice too that maybe he's just saying the things people say, but he says, he more or less says here, and he says in other dialogues, like he's spent his life in Athens and that's where he wants to be. Probably because Athens is a city of speech. It's a city where people are free to go around, where everybody can mix with everybody, where it's built around this idea that people are going to talk and discuss. I don't know that a guy like Socrates could exist in a city like Sparta. So in a way, we talked before when we talked about contrasted Pericles' speech about Athens with the Constitution of Sparta that Xenophon talks about. We talked about the different values those cities stand for. And if you go back and look over again the kind of values that Pericles says Athens stands for, I think you can see that the kind of thing Socrates does is part of that world, right? You need a city that's built around the idea of cultivating human flourishing, cultivating the things of the mind, cultivating the speech and so on, cultivating openness. You got to have that if you're going to have philosophers. And that's presumably a big part of why those sophists I mentioned, those sort of wandering teachers who are kind of like some of the beginnings of the tradition of philosophy, they come from democratic cities. Right? Socrates is a kind of a version of those sophists. He's not exactly the same as them for reasons that he gives. But the thing he's doing in a sort of broader cultural picture, the thing he's doing is quite a bit like the kind of thing that Prodicus, Gorgias, Protagoras do. There are some differences, but he's sort of that same kind of thing. And so what I'm saying, like, I think you can probably see a reason why these kind of people come out of the democratic cities. Let me put that a different way. In a significant way, democracy either, you might say, spawns or encourages this kind of behavior, right? The thing Socrates is in a certain way paradigmatic or emblematic of what democracy is about. There's something powerfully democratic about the kind of activity Socrates engages in the sense that it's something that comes from and is encouraged by that kind of political environment. So there you can think again, what does it mean for the city? Well, I mean, they're going to find him guilty. What does it mean for the city to condemn him? For the city, as represented in the law courts, to condemn him? Anyway, so he's my point here is that he announces here. Maybe we don't know exactly why he announces it here, but elsewhere he backs it up. He says that he really thinks Athens is a great place. So that's part of what I think we have to bring to bear to understand and analyze this too. Anyway, a little bit more. He says, so he stands for the good, and he stands for like building his life around pursuing the good and trying to get other people to do it, and trying to get people who are doing the wrong thing to change and become good people. That's what he thinks philosophy is, and that's what he stands on. And that's why he irritates people. But so he goes on, he says, know well then that the God orders this. When we already know why he's saying that. And he says, and I suppose that until now, no greater good has arisen for you in the city than this, my service to the gods. Wow, that's a pretty big claim, right? He's saying the thing he does ultimately is the greatest service to people. Why? Because he's turning them towards what they should be doing. He's turning them towards the good. That does seem like a pretty big deal. It does seem like there's a good reason to say that. It's a striking claim, though, for him to say about himself, like, this thing that I'm doing, that's the most important thing. But he doesn't say I'm the greatest guy. It's not that. Because he's saying he's doing the service of the gods. So he's saying, like, my life is built around the idea that this is the greatest good and I serve the greatest good. Right? So it's not that he personally happens to do a great thing. It's that he is an agent of that most important thing. Right? And then he says, for I go around and do nothing but persuade you not to care for bodies and money before, nor as vehemently as, how your soul will be the best possible. And that's what he takes a stand on. And it's right, and then it's at that point that he says, "Do not make disturbances, men of Athens." So presumably at that point, when he says, "I'm the greatest good to the city," the jury is going, "Oh, what are you talking about? This is crazy!" Right? You have to imagine the jury kind of erupting in like grumpy sounds there. So he has to say, "Calm down, guys. Listen to what I'm saying." That's kind of interesting. He says, "But listen." And then he says a little bit more. He says, this is now at 30D. I think if he was going to irritate those people, he probably couldn't have gone much farther than what he's about to say here. Well, maybe. There may be one thing later he's going to say that would irritate people even more. But here he really pushes it. Is he trying to be irritating? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe he is. But he is also going to the greatest lengths to really say what he believes to be true. And so at 30D he says, "So I, men of Athens, am now far from making a defense speech on my own behalf." He's not worried about it. He says, "You can kill me if you want. You can't kill me. You can't hurt me." He says, he had said earlier, 30C, "For know well that if you kill me, since I'm the sort of man that I say I am, you won't harm me more than you'll harm yourselves." And there's going to be another point about that in a minute. Actually, right after that, he says, "For Miletus or Anytus would not harm me, for I do not suppose that it's sanctioned for a better man to be harmed by a worse." I think he's saying it's not possible for a better person to be harmed by a worse. Now here again is that issue of harm. Like, what do you mean by that? And I think just like the earlier issue of whether you voluntarily do bad, or the issue of taking a stand on what you take to be best, we're here saying a good person cannot be harmed by a bad person, right? The issue of harm is not straightforward. Like, so again, that's the point he's been making. Some people say, "Death, you're really being harmed if you die." And Socrates says, "No, I would be harmed if I did something unjust. Then I would have damaged, who I am. I would have damaged my soul, basically. But death in and of itself doesn't harm me. It's just one of those things that might befall a person." So the point again is that harm, we sometimes talk about harm as if it were just a sort of factual thing. And he's saying, no, you can't really understand what that means without understanding who you're talking about and how that person evaluates things and so on. Something like that. Anyway, I'll just add that passage to that sort of pile of things that are part of a set of things to be interpreted together. Anyway, but let me go on and read this. He says, "So I, men of Athens, am now far from making a defense speech on my own behalf. I do it rather on your behalf." His speech isn't in defense of himself because he doesn't believe he needs to defend himself, and he's not threatened by anything because he's not worried about what anybody's going to do to him, and he also doesn't take the accusations seriously in the sense that he's tried to show that they're not plausible. So he is quite confident that what he does is good. So he does not believe that he's the guy in the weaker position, right? On the contrary, he's saying this is where we're going to find out whether you people, you jury, are going to act justly or not. We're going to see whether you're worthy to be in the position you've been put in of sitting in a courtroom judging the fate of a human being and judging the value of these issues. So he says, the truth of this trial is not that Socrates is on trial. The truth of this trial is that Athens and its law courts are on trial. And by what you do, we're going to see what kind of place you really are. So he says he's giving this speech really to give the court a chance to do the right thing. Right? So he says, "I do it rather on your behalf, so that you do not do something wrong concerning the gift of the God to you by voting to condemn me." Right? It's up to you to recognize that somebody who's doing what I'm doing is something you should be protecting, not something you should be condemning. And so I'm saying this to give you a chance to do the right thing, and you're not going to do it. And then he goes on to say one more thing. He says, finish that sentence. It's the next sentence. He says, "For if you kill me, you will not easily discover another one like me." Right? Because it is a pretty singular thing. "Who has simply been set upon the city by the god, as though upon a great and well-born horse, who is rather sluggish because of his great size and needs to be awakened by some gadfly." So he's saying, this is a very famous image from this, Socrates comparing himself to a gadfly. He's saying Athens is a great city. It's kind of like a horse that's big and sleepy. And, the fly comes and stings it, and that's what wakes it up. And Athens is kind of like that too. It could be a great city, but it's asleep. And Socrates says, my job is to be stinging you. I'm just a tiny little fly. You're a big, powerful city. But I'm this little stinger trying to wake you up. Wake you up to what? Wake you up to the need to care about the good, right? It's a very significant image there, right? But him as a gadfly. And he says, "So it seems the God has set me upon the city as someone of this sort. I awaken and persuade and reproach each one of you, and I do not stop settling down everywhere upon you the whole day." He says, of course I irritate you, but that's the thing that's actually valuable to you. You need someone to wake you up. He says, maybe you're going to be like a drowsy person who just wants to slap that thing away. That's what's going to happen. And then you can spend the rest of your life asleep. But anyway, so that's I'm going to say one more thing about it, but that's the first of the big points. Where he's described himself. He adds one more thing after that, just about this theme that he's following the God, and he says, "Look, doing this has led me to poverty." So he says, I never do anything that makes me any money, and so on. So he says, the simple fact that I am so poor should further be evidence to you that, I'm not in this for something else. Nobody would do the things I do if that person were not experiencing himself as answering to a kind of higher power, right? Anyway, so that up to 31c, I think, completes that little story, and that's basically his answer to the question of whether or not he believes in the gods. And so from the point of view of the trial, that's important. And I think that's an important issue, and I've tried to stress how we might use that to think about issues of the gods and so on. But I also don't think that's in some ways the most important thing. The most important thing, I think, is the basic point he's making about taking a stand, his concern for the good, and so on. That's what I really want to take out of it. And now I'm a little more quickly want to go over the last thing I was after, from 31c to 33a. And he says, so here's what I do. I go around talking to individual people. And you might say, isn't that funny that you do that in private? Why don't you seek political office? Wouldn't it be, if you're so concerned about the city and you're so concerned about the people, why don't you become a politician? And he says, I haven't done that. Why? And he says, because if you get into politics, you wouldn't last a day, because this kind of thing can't happen there, right? So you can read, you will read that, of course, and the things he says are clear enough about how unscrupulous, dishonest, and whatever else politics is. But here he makes a couple of interesting points, and this again, it comes back to the charge. So he says, so he begins with this. He said, why didn't I go into politics? And he says, at the end of 31c and then the beginning of 31d, the cause of this is what you heard me speak of many times and in many places, that something divine and daimonic comes to me, a voice, which is, of course, what Meletus was writing about in his indictment. This is something that began for me in childhood. A sort of voice comes, and whenever it comes, it always turns me away from whatever I'm about to do, but never turns me forward. I mean, so he's saying, he has this experience of a voice that says, don't do that. I take it that's a fairly familiar phenomenon. It's, some version of the phenomenon we call conscience. A little voice inside you, your better self telling you this. Well, he's identifying something like that, but he's calling it daimonic or divine. He's saying, that's where a kind of higher voice speaks to me, and presumably would to anybody else. So he's talking about this supposed divinity he's introducing, and he's saying, yeah, this is what that thing is. And he says what that is it's something that there's nothing in me that tells me straightforwardly, this is the good thing to do. I always have to exercise my own judgment to try to figure out what's good and so on. But this thing stops me when I'm doing something bad. It's no, you're breaking the rules or you're going the wrong way. And I think that's kind of what the voice of conscience is like. It says, don't do that. You're cheating, right? He says he's heard this his whole life, something telling him, don't do that thing. And he says, that's opposed me. If I ever thought of going into politics, it says no, that's not the right thing. But he says, on the other hand, when I came into court today, knowing that it's quite likely I'm going to be sentenced to death, that voice didn't say no. There was nothing in me and my values spoke against coming. It's fine. It's fine for me to come and risk death here. So that's this little new divinity he's supposedly introducing. So this is where he's now answering to that part of the charge and saying what that is. I'm not going to pursue that issue of the charge further here, aside from noting that, but I do just want to mention a couple of things he says. He says here, what did he do? He tells you here that about a couple of things that happen in political life and a couple of things that he did that again prove he's going to stand on anything. So yeah, he fought in those military battles and risked death. Yeah, but also a couple of times when he had to participate in political life, things came up that were life-threatening. So at one point, because of the way the democracy worked, different people from different groups, would just circulate. Like for this month, these people were the ones who handled certain jobs in the council. This month, these people handled certain jobs in the council, and so on. Anyway, at a certain point, Socrates' name sort of came up by lot, and he was in the position of being one of the people who had to make some decisions at the sort of highest council of the governing body of the city. And this was a time when, in the war, near the end of the war, somebody, a guy who turned out to be a pretty bad guy actually, Theramenes, brought a charge against some generals. He said, these guys did the wrong thing in this battle. And he proposed that these people should be tried and punished in a way that actually violated proper process, violated due process. And Socrates said no to that. But the guy who proposed this was a compelling orator, and the general sentiment was like this, and people. So there was a lot of pressure to go with this violation of due process, and in fact, that's what they did. But Socrates said no. I absolutely say no to that. So his point is there too. He was prepared to take a stand, and as it happened, he didn't actually get in trouble for that. They did violate due process. They did do bad things. He did take a stand on the thing that people subsequently decided was the correct thing. But I guess his opposition was insignificant. It was small enough, like it could be bypassed, that he didn't have to pay a price for it. But he risked something pretty serious there. Right, and so he's both showing you again that he's prepared to die. He's showing you something about his character, but he's also showing you something about what happens in political life. You're going to have to deal with a lot of crappy stuff, and that's going to be the diet every day. And so another time during the reign of the 30, which we've talked about at the end of the Peloponnesian War, he said, I was one of a group of guys called in, and they said, go get Leon of Salamis and bring him back here. We're going to kill him. Right, and so he says that's what the 30 tried to do. They tried to implicate as many people as they could in their acts. They'd threaten people with death and say, you go do this or else we're going to kill you. And they'd get people out of fear to go and do the things that they wanted to have done, and then, et cetera, compromise people and so on. And Socrates just didn't do it. So there were 5 of them. He said, when after that meeting, I went home. But the other 4 guys did go get Leon, and they brought him back, and he was killed. But Socrates didn't. And Socrates said, look, if the 30 had lasted longer, that would have been my life. For disobeying them like that, they would have wiped me out. But as we saw, the 30 only lasted for something like 8 months or 10 months, and so he's lucky. He opposed them, and it didn't cost him his life. But so Socrates says, right, these are the only 2 times I ever really did anything political. And both times, the fact that I took a stand meant I was basically doomed. As it happened, he lived through those 2, but he couldn't have made a life being that kind of guy in politics. You should connect that with his earlier remarks about politicians and what kind of people they are. And you should also think about what's happening in the law court, right? It's the same thing. He's taking a certain stand in a context where that's not that kind of thing that's going to fly. So those stories are pretty interesting. They tell you more about Socrates and about the depths of his commitment to doing the good. So that's what he says. That he gives you these stories, and then he says at 32e, do you suppose then that I would have survived so many years if I had been publicly acted, and had acted in a manner worthy of a good man, coming to the aid of the just things, and as one ought, regarding this as most important? He says, far from it. That's you can't do that and be a politician. You can't do that and be in politics. And so then the last word here, he said, for through all my life, if I was ever active in public at all, it is apparent that I was the sort of man, in public and in private I was the same, who never conceded anything to anyone contrary to the just. And that's Socrates' statement of who he is, and what he stands for and what matters. And that's really basically where I want to leave it. And I want you to think about that idea about the commitment to the good as what he's saying philosophy is really about. And so we've talked about a variety of things there. We've talked about his answer to the charges. We've talked about how that relates to religion. We've talked about what it means he values, and we're going to go on to see more as we now go on to see him in conversation with others when we read the Republic. I just want to bring out one more little theme just to sort of connect this up to earlier things. Like we've seen some connections with the constitutions of Sparta and Athens. We've seen some connections with Pericles' funeral oration about being worthy to your city. We've seen some comparisons with Antigone, both to the variety of things about the honoring the gods in the second chorus, but also to the issue of Antigone taking a stand. We've talked about the kind of pursuit Socrates is involved in and how that is in a way a distinctly and characteristically Athenian kind of pursuit. And then notice the interesting reality that city is also putting him to death, and that's worth thinking about. And I think we will come back and think about that theme again. I just want to make one more little connection, and that is the relationship between something Socrates says here, that thing at the very end, or I mean the thing I've been talking about today entirely, and the pre-Socratic guys. Remember we were talking with, when we're doing Heraclitus and Parmenides and Pythagoras and so on, and the second chorus, we were pursuing this theme of the nature of the real, what reality is, the terms of reality. And we moved from just the recognition of reality up to, when we got finally to the second chorus of Antigone, this sort of rich sense of reality as nature. I want to say that Socrates is here adding something to that, because his really, all this talk about the God and all that sort of stuff, I think he's adding the notion of the good to the notion of the real. He's saying, he's interested in the character of reality too, and he's saying that ultimately the character of reality is that, it kind of has the form of a commandment. It's a commandment to be good. So I'd like you to think about that, about Socrates here as adding to that same kind of investigation we've been seeing, moving from the recognition of the real, sort of through its mathematical character, to its character as nature, to its character as the good. I'd like you just to think about that. Anyway, let's wrap it up there, and then we're going to move on now to the Republic.